77 years ago, in a ruined German city, the most important trial of the 20th century reached its peak. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. The trial of the main war criminals of Nazi Germany. Today, it feels obvious. Of course, there had to be a tribunal. Of course, the people who unleashed total war and industrial murder had to sit in the dock. But if we rewind to the early 1940s, one fact becomes shocking. Most of the world still did not understand the full scale of what Nazi Germany had done. The machine of extermination, the camps, the gas vans, the mass shootings, was already working like a precise, cruel factory. But outside the occupied territories, many of these crimes were only rumors or scattered reports. Only when Allied and Soviet troops physically entered the liberated camps did the horror become undeniable. Only then did journalists and cameras bring images of ovens, pits, and piles of bodies to the rest of the planet. Many of the things that would be said in court at Nuremberg left people literally speechless. The scale, the planning, the cold bureaucratic logic of murder, Europe had never seen anything like it, neither before nor after. So how did the idea of this trial appear? By 1943, it had become clear that the coalition of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union would eventually defeat Hitler's Germany. Victory was still far away, but the direction of the war had changed. A new question appeared. What should be done with the war criminals? By that moment, there were already thousands of documented atrocities. On Soviet territory, burned villages, testimonies of camp survivors, mass shootings, torture, deportations, the looting of museums and factories. Similar crimes in Poland, in France, in Yugoslavia, in Greece, almost everywhere the German army and the SS had passed. This wasn't random cruelty. It was state policy. On 30th October 1943, the Allies signed the Moscow Declaration. For the first time, they officially stated that those responsible for these crimes would be punished. But how exactly? Here, the story becomes very uncomfortable. The Allies agreed on punishment, but disagreed on the method. At first, almost nobody insisted on a big public court. Inside the American leadership, there was a simple proposal. Draw up a list of the worst Nazi leaders and execute them without trial, by firing squad or hanging. No long hearings, no speeches, no cross-examination, just a political decision. Winston Churchill opposed hanging as too theatrical. He argued that these men should be shot as soldiers. At one point, he discussed with Stalin possible lists of future victims, tens of thousands of names from every level of the Nazi state, party leaders, SS and Gestapo officers, ministers, industrialists, generals. In some early drafts, numbers like 50,000 appeared as a reasonable figure. The logic was brutal. We already know what they did. We don't need them to explain anything. We just need them to pay. At the same time, another line of thinking appeared. Franklin Roosevelt believed that punishment could not be limited to a small group at the top. In his view, Germany as a society bore responsibility for what had happened. From this grew the dangerous idea of collective guilt, that the entire German nation should somehow pay for the crimes of the regime. Eventually, though, another concern started to dominate: the fear of silence. If there was no open court, there would be no sworn testimonies, no cross-examinations, no documents read aloud in front of judges, no official record of how the war had really been planned, financed, and fought, and what had been done to civilians in occupied Europe. A secret execution of the Nazi elite would have satisfied revenge, but left history with almost no evidence. There was also a more awkward reason the Allies hesitated. In open hearings, the defendants might start talking about things the victors preferred not to discuss. The Munich Agreement of 1938, when European powers handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler in the hope of peace. The pre-war economic support and investments from Western corporations in the Third Reich. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, with its secret protocols to divide Eastern Europe. All of that could appear in the courtroom, in front of cameras. But slowly, the idea that the trial must be open and legal, not simply political, began to win. The world needed a precedent, a clear statement that aggressive war, mass murder, and extermination would be judged not only by history, but by law. There had been an attempt after World War I to do something similar. It failed. Germany had been allowed to judge itself in Leipzig. Of some 900 officers and officials summoned, most never appeared. A handful were lightly punished. Many simply walked free. The whole process quietly collapsed and was soon forgotten. Nuremberg was not going to be allowed to die that way. On 20th of November, 1945, in the bomb-scarred city, whose medieval center had been almost wiped out by Allied bombing, the International Military Tribunal opened its first session. The main charges were four. 1. Conspiracy to seize power in Germany and prepare aggressive war. 2. Crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression. 3. War crimes, violations of the laws and customs of war. 4. Crimes against humanity, murder, extermination, enslavement, and persecution of civilian populations. It was not only individual leaders on trial. Entire structures of the Nazi state were examined. The National Socialist Party, NSDAP, the SS, the Gestapo, parts of the Wehrmacht, the German government and its ministries, the Reichsbank, and major industrial concerns that fueled the war machine. 4 countries acted as prosecutors and judges: the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The appearance of France caused mixed reactions. On the one hand, France had been occupied, humiliated, and partially destroyed. On the other hand, there had been the Vichy regime, which openly collaborated with Hitler and helped deport Jews. Some journalists and politicians asked a bitter question. Could the country that once signed an armistice with Germany now sit in judgment over German leaders? But France was also the homeland of Charles de Gaulle and the resistance. The French prosecutors had fought the Nazis themselves. Symbolically, the tribunal needed not just victors from abroad, but also a Western European nation that had known occupation and had raised its own underground army. So France took its place at the table. The tribunal's composition was fixed: judges from each of the 4 powers. Chief prosecutors: Robert Jackson for the United States, Hartley Shawcross for Britain, Roman Rudenko for the Soviet Union, François de Menthon for France. Once the judges and prosecutors had been approved, the defendants were informed that they had the right to a defense. Here came another uncomfortable twist. At first, the Allies wanted simply to appoint lawyers for them from their own countries, but the leading Nazi defendants began to refuse these appointed defenders. Hermann Göring was the first to object. How, he asked, could anyone trust a process where both the judges and the defense came from the victorious side? If the tribunal was to have even a minimum of legitimacy, German defendants would have to be defended by German lawyers. Many German attorneys did not want this role. To stand up in court as Göring's lawyer or Ribbentrop's lawyer meant carrying a stigma for the rest of one's life. Few wanted to be remembered as the advocate who tried to save the Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe from the gallows. In the end, the tribunal had to make a formal promise. No lawyer would be punished, banned from practice, or prosecuted in post-war Germany simply for defending Nazi leaders at Nuremberg. Only under that guarantee did German defense attorneys agree to appear. By the time the trial opened, some of the central figures of the regime had already escaped human judgment. The main criminal, Adolf Hitler, had committed suicide in Berlin before the final capitulation. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the Reich Security Main Office, the man responsible for the system of camps, mass shootings, medical experiments, and the machinery of genocide, also died by suicide shortly after his capture. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister whose speeches had poisoned an entire nation, killed himself together with his wife and children in Hitler's bunker. Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful party chancellor and de facto number 2 in the last years of the Reich, disappeared in the chaos of Berlin's fall. For decades, no one could say with certainty where and how he died. Heinrich Müller, the feared head of the Gestapo, also vanished. Rumors spoke of South America, secret flights, rat lines through Spain and Portugal. His fate became one of the darkest mysteries of the Nazi leadership. Others simply ran. Some slipped along secret paths of the wolves, through Bavaria into Franco's Spain or Salazar's Portugal. Some made it all the way to Latin America, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, where they tried to dissolve into new lives under false names. Men like Joseph Mengele would be hunted for decades. But many stayed in Germany, and these men now sat in the dock at Nuremberg. Who were they? The list of defendants looked like a compressed model of the Third Reich's power pyramid. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and for many years Hitler's designated successor, the highest-ranking prisoner and the central figure of the trial. Rudolf Hess, for a long time Hitler's deputy in the Nazi Party, a man from the inner circle whose bizarre solo flight to Britain in 1941 ended with his capture and lifelong imprisonment. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister of the Reich, responsible for treaties, alliances, and the diplomacy that prepared and covered aggression. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command. The military leadership tried to claim that they simply obeyed orders, but documents and testimony showed something else. They knew about mass shootings, reprisal massacres, and the execution of prisoners and commissars, and they signed many of those orders themselves. Alfred Rosenberg, the party's chief ideologue, one of the architects of the racist worldview that justified conquest and extermination. Hans Frank, a lawyer who became Governor General of occupied Poland. Under his administration, ghettos, camps, deportations, and systematic plunder of Polish culture and property became daily routine. Julius Streicher, publisher of the rabidly anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer. His role was ideological, not military. Week after week, he poured hatred into millions of German homes, preparing ordinary people to accept that an entire group could be marked for destruction. Walter Funk, Minister of Economics and head of the Reichsbank, deeply involved in exploiting occupied economies and processing stolen property, including gold taken from camp victims. Karl Dönitz, Grand Admiral who succeeded Hitler as head of state in the last days of the war, responsible for the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. Erich Raeder, former commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, tied to the naval buildup and aggressive operations at sea. Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, who turned the upbringing of German children and teenagers into political and military indoctrination. Fritz Sauckel, the slave labor czar, general plenipotentiary for labor deployment, who organized the deportation and forced labor of millions of civilians from occupied countries. Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht High Command, signing and directing key operational orders from the invasion of Poland to the war against the Soviet Union. Franz von Papen, conservative politician and diplomat whose intrigues helped bring Hitler to power. He would later be acquitted, but at Nuremberg, he sat in the dock like the others. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, one of the main figures in the Anschluss of Austria and later Reich Commissioner in the occupied Netherlands, where terror and deportations were carried out under his authority. Albert Speer, officially architect of the Reich, in reality also Minister of Armaments, responsible for war industry and the massive use of forced labor. Konstantin von Neurath, experienced diplomat and former foreign minister who served as Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, overseeing repression and Germanization. Hans Fritzsche, senior radio commentator and official in the propaganda ministry, whose calm voice on the airwaves justified the war, demanded harsher measures against Jews and enemies, and helped normalize the regime's crimes for millions of listeners. This was not just one madman and his henchmen. It was an entire system: party, army, secret police, government, banks, industrial giants, propaganda, all symbolically placed on a single bench. There was another silent participant at Nuremberg: paper. The Nazi state had documented its own crimes with terrifying discipline: orders, reports, memos, transport lists, execution statistics. Everything was typed, stamped, filed, and sent up the chain of command. Units of the SS and Einsatzgruppen reported in precise bureaucratic language how many Jews, partisans, and civilians had been shot in a given week. They complained about the psychological strain on execution squads and suggested more efficient methods of killing. Industrial firms submitted technical proposals for gas vans and for the use of Zyklon B, treating mass murder as a logistical and engineering task. Tons of these documents, not figuratively, but literally tons of paper, were seized from ministries, party offices, and secret archives. Some were hidden in mines, some sunk in lakes, some burned. Enough survived. For the archivists and investigators who worked through them in cold, unheated rooms, this was hell on paper. For the court, it became decisive evidence. Nuremberg would not only show the world the images of the camps, it would lay out, line by line, how a modern state had turned law, industry, finance, and bureaucracy into tools for systematic extermination. And that is where the trial truly began. Inside the Nuremberg courtroom, the main evidence against the Nazi leadership was not emotion, but paper and film. The judges were not only shown witnesses, they were shown the way a modern state had turned law, accounting, and logistics into a weapon. The prosecution's strategy was simple in form and brutal in content. First, prove that the war had been planned, long before the first shot in Poland. Then, prove that aggression and occupation were accompanied not by excesses, but by a system of mass crimes. Finally, show that the men sitting in the dock had not just stood nearby, but had designed, signed, financed, or propagated that system. Day after day, the court read from Nazi documents, telegrams, and orders about the invasion of Poland and the attack on the Soviet Union. Minutes from meetings where Hitler and his generals calmly discussed how many millions of prisoners of war might starve to death. Instructions on the final solution of the Jewish question, written in dry, administrative language. The numbers were cold. Hundreds of thousands shot in one region, millions deported in another, factories dismantled and shipped to Germany, art collections cataloged and stolen. The judges heard how ghettos were created and then liquidated, how entire villages in Belarus or Ukraine were burned with their inhabitants for suspected partisan activity, how hostages in France, the Netherlands, and Yugoslavia were shot in ratios. 10 civilians for one German killed, 50 for one officer. For a global audience that had only seen frontline newsreels, this was the first time the mechanics of extermination were laid out in full. The prosecution then moved to something even more shocking: film. The Allied and Soviet armies, when they liberated the camps, had filmed what they saw. At Nuremberg, these films were edited into documentaries and shown in the courtroom as official evidence. On the screen, the judges, the accused, and everyone present saw barbed wire and watchtowers over endless barracks, mountains of shoes and children's toys, warehouses full of hair cut from the dead, skeletal prisoners staring straight into the lens, not yet understanding that the war, for them, might be over. The camera moved over open pits where bulldozers pushed bodies, over the gas chambers and crematoria, over the names of places that would become symbols of horror: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek. Some of the defendants looked away. Some, like Göring, tried to remain stone-faced. Others were visibly shaken. For a number of them, this was the first time they had seen the full result of orders that, for years, had existed for them only as paper and numbers. The tribunal made one message clear: this was not an accident. It was planned, it was budgeted, it was reported up the chain of command, and you were that chain. The defense tried to build several lines of escape at once. The first line was the oldest excuse in any army: we only followed orders. Generals and staff officers insisted that the Wehrmacht was a clean army. They had fought a hard but normal war. Any atrocities, they claimed, were the responsibility of the SS, the SD, and the Gestapo. Documents destroyed that myth. Written orders signed by military leaders spoke directly about shooting political commissars, taking and killing hostages, starving prisoners, burning villages suspected of partisan aid. Reports returned to the High Command with exact figures of executed, deported, shot while trying to escape. The second line of defense tried to do something else: put all the blame on the dead. Hitler, they said, had controlled everything. The living in the dock were little people, functionaries who had been dragged along by the will of one madman. They spoke of state discipline, of their oath, of the impossibility of resisting. But the evidence again worked against them. Minutes of conferences showed active participation, not passive obedience. Many of the men now calling themselves Little Wheels had, in earlier documents, enthusiastically offered their own radical proposals, competed in cruelty, pushed to go faster and more decisively. The third line of defense was insanity and amnesia. Rudolf Hess suddenly claimed he remembered very little, and that his mental state made any trial meaningless. Psychiatrists were brought in. His behavior in court, sometimes indifferent, sometimes theatrical, made an impression, but not the one the defense wanted. The judges recognized him as fit to stand trial. In one way or another, all lines of defense circled around the same desperate attempt to turn personal responsibility back into fate, orders, and circumstances. Nuremberg's answer to that attempt would become one of its main legacies. The prosecution, especially the American team under Robert Jackson, insisted on a new and very simple idea. There are crimes so serious that no order, no law of any state can justify them. A government can declare aggression defensive, genocide necessary, and occupation legal. It can write any words it wants into its own code. But there are limits that come not from a dictator's pen, but from humanity itself. At Nuremberg, these limits were formulated in legal language. Planning and unleashing a war of aggression is a crime. Mass murder, extermination, and slavery of civilian populations are crimes. Belonging to an organization that exists for these purposes and knowingly taking part in its work is itself a crime. And I just followed orders is not a shield if those orders are criminal. For a world that had grown used to thinking that the state is always right inside its own borders, this was a revolution. There was another uncomfortable side to the trial, which many observers noticed even then. The judges were all from the victorious countries. The crimes under discussion were the crimes of the defeated side. Allied bombing of cities, the use of atomic weapons, mass deportations on the Eastern Front. None of this appeared in the indictments. No one was going to judge the winners in Nuremberg. Critics would later call this victor's justice. And they would have a point. Yet even with this obvious inequality, Nuremberg created something that had not existed before. A legal language to describe crimes committed by states against individuals, and a principle that leaders could be held personally accountable. For better or worse, that language would outlive the era of occupation administrations and military tribunals. On 30th September and 1st October 1946, after months of hearings, the tribunal announced its verdicts. 12 of the 22 main defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Frick, Julius Streicher, Fritz Sauckel, Alfred Jodl, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, Martin Bormann in absentia. Others received long prison sentences. Rudolf Hess, life imprisonment. Walter Funk, life. Erich Raeder, life, later released for health reasons. Albert Speer, 20 years. Baldur von Schirach, 20 years. Konstantin von Neurath, 15 years. Karl Dönitz, 10 years. 3 were acquitted: Hans Fritzsche, Franz von Papen, and Hjalmar Schacht. The reactions in the courtroom were different. Some tried to give final speeches. Some asked for mercy. Some, like Göring, attempted to use even their last words to justify the regime, to present themselves as patriots punished for loving Germany in the wrong way. For the millions of victims who would never speak again, the court spoke dryly: guilty. In the days before the executions, the condemned men were held in individual cells under constant watch. On the night of 15th October 1946, a few hours before he was to be taken to the gallows, Hermann Göring cheated the rope. He bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule and died in his cell. Exactly how he obtained the capsule remains disputed to this day. Even in death, he managed to create one last unsolved question. The others were led to the scaffold one by one. There were no public spectacles, no crowds, no triumphant music. The executions took place inside the prison, away from cameras. A U.S. Army doctor, checked each body to confirm death. The remains of the hanged men were later cremated. Their ashes were scattered in a river so that no grave could become a shrine. Symbolically, the tribunal was saying, the Third Reich will not have monuments. It will have a verdict. But Nuremberg did not end with the last drop of the noose. The trial changed legal vocabulary. Later, the United Nations and international lawyers would formulate what became known as the Nuremberg Principles, that individuals, including heads of state, can be held criminally responsible under international law. That "I was following orders" does not remove that responsibility, though it can be considered in sentencing. That planning and waging aggressive war is itself a crime. That crimes against humanity can be punished even if they were legal under the internal laws of the state that committed them. These ideas would resurface in later tribunals, for Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, and in discussions about how to judge new wars and new mass crimes. There was another legacy, less legal and more cultural. In Germany and many other countries, the symbols and propaganda of the Third Reich would be banned. Swastikas, SS runes, Nazi slogans, all of it was pushed out of public space. The aim was not only to punish the old regime, but to prevent a new one from wrapping itself in the same flags. Films, books, and school lessons about the war began to use fragments from the Nuremberg materials. Photos of the dock, excerpts from testimony, images from the camp documentaries. The tribunal became not just a legal event, but a kind of moral lens through which later generations would look back at the 1930s and 1940s. And yet, one uncomfortable question has not disappeared. Nuremberg showed what happens when a state turns its entire power toward conquest and extermination, and then loses. The leaders of that state ended up in the dock. But what happens when a powerful country commits crimes and does not lose? Who will try those leaders? Who will collect and read their paperwork under oath? Who will project their wars on a screen in front of judges? Nuremberg did not give a simple answer to that question. It could not. It was, by design, a tribunal of the victors. But the language created there, the very idea that there are crimes which no government has the right to legalize, escaped the walls of that courtroom. It became something that later generations would use to judge not only the past, but the present. The stone building in Nuremberg still stands. Today, it is a museum and a reminder. On the benches where once sat Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and the others, school groups, and tourists now listen to guides explaining how the trial worked. In the glass cases lie copies of the documents that condemned a regime, orders, reports, signatures that once meant life and death and now mean evidence. The most important lesson of that hall is brutally simple. States can lie. Propaganda can lie. Leaders can lie. But if the world insists on keeping the documents, the testimonies and the films, then even after the war is over, the truth can still sit them down in the dock. That is what Nuremberg did. And that is why, decades later, its verdict still speaks.